back. This time we are going to be looking at placing ideologies on spectrums. You may be saying, I thought we did that last time. Yes, we did, but now we're going to go into more detail. After today's class, you should be able to use those terms once again: radical, liberal, conservative, and reactionary. You should be able to visualize them on spectrums, understand the related values, but also apply them to different sources as we unpack them and try to find ideological perspectives. So, one term that often we look at is right wing, and a related term would be left wing. Now, my concern would be that some of these terms will mean different things economically than they do politically. So right now we're looking at a political spectrum. So when I'm talking about right wing on a political spectrum, we're saying reactionary. Let's go back to, a glorious past. Seeking answers to today's questions, we should look to the past. Reactionary are often ultranationalistic people, and they will accept violence to achieve their goals. But sometimes we'll use the word right wing, and we're talking economically about capitalism. That's an economic spectrum. Let us not muddle our waters too much yet. Left wing, when we're talking about left wing on a political spectrum, if we go all the way to the extreme left, we're talking about radicals. Much like the reactionaries to their extreme right, they are willing to use violence to achieve their goals. Instead of being ultranationalist, they may be internationalist in outlook. They're willing to make sudden and dramatic changes, not to go to a glorious past, but to go and try something new in the future. The middle would be moderates, and they're unaccepting of violence. So we've seen this spectrum before. We've seen these terms before. But what I'd like to add to this is this quadrant now. So now we are going to muddy the waters. So you could take your political spectrum that we've been talking about, and you could add in an economic element. So in this quadrant, we have the difference between freedom and control. So we have democracy at one end and authoritarianism at the other. Now, does democracy align with reactionary or radical? No. Anytime you're looking at a spectrum, you have to consider the labeling and what is it exactly that they're presenting. So here at the one end of the spectrum, they're just saying it's democracy at one end and authoritarianism at the other. Taken to an extreme before, we saw authoritarianism at both ends, right? Radical and reactionary. This is a different line. This has freedom at one end, control at the other. So political freedom, political control. Democracy, dictatorship. But then we're going to add an economic element here. Economic freedom is capitalism. Economic control is socialism. Now we're going to combine the two and see what quadrants end up being created. So if you have freedom politically and freedom economically, you have democratic capitalism. This year, we'll study the United States of America as our case study to show what is democratic capitalism. But you could also have capitalism, a relatively free market, but you may have politically control. You may have a dictator, and we call that authoritarian capitalism. I want you to think about it. What would be a good case study? If you're saying Nazi Germany, you are correct. So in Nazi Germany, we still had, politically, we had one party, we had a lot of control, but there were individual entrepreneurs like Oskar Schindler that owned his factory. There was still the right to private property, depending upon your ethnicity and political leanings. So we have authoritarian capitalism. Now, we may have a society that has free elections, so you have a democracy, you have competition, so you have a democracy, but the people choose to share their wealth. So then we are getting into the quadrant of democratic socialism. Democratic socialism today, many people may suggest that good case studies would be our Scandinavian countries like Norway and Sweden and Finland. The Swedes may not identify as democratic socialists, but compared to us, they certainly are. Here in Canada, in terms of our political parties, the major political parties federally, which party is the most democratic socialist? We would say this is the land of the NDP. So democratic socialism is when you take elements of political freedom, democracy, and you add in some elements of greater economic control, greater equalization of our economic lives. The other option, the fourth quarter, the fourth quadrant, would be what if we have both political control and economic control? We have an authoritarian state politically, where there might be a one-party state. You might have one individual at the top of that party, and the goal of the economy is to share wealth. That's authoritarian socialism. That's the USSR. So it is important to be able to look at those four quadrants and be able to understand the different case studies that each one was, each would illustrate each one, and we'll certainly do that throughout the year. Once again, we've seen this spectrum before. This is an application of it to the Canadian chart. There are ways to look at the spectrum and look at the values that they have in greater detail. So I do have a document that we're going to bring up here, and it is an additional document that looks at the political spectrum. So again, political spectrum would have dictatorships at both ends. You could have a reactionary dictatorship. You could have a radical dictatorship. The area in the middle, the blue, that's where the majority of Canadians would be today. So we have moderates in the middle, we have liberals and conservatives. The more liberal you are, the further you drift towards the left as you value social change. The more conservative you might be, the more you're attached to the status quo. Then we have the economic spectrum. In an economic spectrum, you have the idea of government collectivism, public ownership, economic equality on the left, and you have individualism on the right. So on the right, you'd have laissez-faire capitalism with philosophers like Adam Smith. On the left, you would have centrally planned economics inspired by philosophers like Karl Marx. So you have an economic spectrum and you have a political spectrum. A political spectrum may have democracy in it, it may have different authoritarian states, and an economic spectrum is talking about how should we answer the basic economic questions, what to produce, how to produce it, how to allocate what we produce. Now, when we combine the two, that's when we get that spectrum that we just looked at, that quadrant. When we combine the two spectrums, we can see that when you have dictatorship plus capitalism, you get fascism. When you have dictatorship plus socialism, you have communism. When you have democracy plus socialism, you have democratic socialism, and then there's democratic capitalism. So we have some more values here, application of a spectrum to show values. This is the economic collectivism. The incentive to work. Why do we work? Why do we have jobs? It's to serve the common good. It's to serve the community. It's to create egalitarianism. From each according to his ability to each according to his need. That's the maxim of Karl Marx, and that's what drives me to work. I'm not driven to work for my own glory, but for the glory of my brother. I am my brother's keeper, and as a fellow citizen, it is my responsibility to work for the collective good. That the state should coordinate the wealth that we can create so that we can ensure that everyone benefits. Workers share in the profit of others. They share in the benefit of the entire community. We work towards the common good, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Therefore, we might have to control wages and prices so that all have access to essential goods like electricity and bread and gasoline, rather than seeing things fluctuate on a free market. Cooperation is good. Therefore, we accept things like state monopolies. We accept things like social assistance. And in order to provide for these things, we may have high corporate taxes, or, taken to an extreme, all corporations may be public. All corporations may be crown corporations or government corporations, so that the wealth created by those corporations can be funneled back in to those programs that are needed to equalize the wealth of all. We're going to have universal programs like healthcare and education. We're going to have government subsidies for those living beneath a poverty line. We want a decent standard of living for all. We must redistribute wealth from those who have to those who have not. We are going to protect our economy and protect those within it. And there will be massive regulations. So we can avoid some of the boom-bust uncertainty that happens in a free market. Capitalism only benefits the rich. We're going to organize our economy to benefit all. So it's important to understand economic collectivism. You have a 45% chance that you're going to be writing an essay in August that is meant to take a position on the economic policies of a government. And it'll either be a quote that promotes collectivism or attacks collectivism, or promotes individualism or attacks individualism. And therefore, collectivism is one of the responses that you could take and argue in defense of in your essay. So all of these points that are listed here need to become very familiar with you in terms of your writing. Economic individualism is the flip, right? So the incentive to work comes from my own greed. I want to pursue my own self-interest. That we unlock that by allowing for private and personal property. That unlocks entrepreneurship and really allows the true wealth of the nation to grow. That the best approach for the government is a hands-off of the economy, because when the government takes a hands-off approach, then rather than having a few hundred or thousand government workers try to answer those basic economic questions, people closer to the actual market, better suited to answer the questions, can do that. Everyone should provide for themselves. The weak should be no exception. If you are weak, you need to find something of value to offer the marketplace. There's nothing more democratic than that. Unfettered operation of the marketplace is the best way to create wealth, and therefore prices should be determined by supply and demand, not manipulated by the government. Competition is good. If prices are high, then that should encourage competition, and eventually when you have competition in that industry, prices will go down. If there's only one gas station within 500 kilometers, gas prices are going to be high. But if that gas station is very profitable, it should encourage someone else to create a rival gas station that will also create a lot of revenue. And because there's two gas stations in town, you would hope, now they can have some kind of price war and the prices can go down. Low corporate taxes would allow corporations to reinvest and expand their enterprise. We could see privatization of all industries, including healthcare, where it's a user-pay system. So there's an onus on individuals to take care of their health and therefore to be preventative. Very little government regulation, tax concessions may go to corporations to get them to locate there. Free trade should be the motto of the country, and they're going to support things like the IMF and the World Trade Organization. All right, so this is a very short document that helps to outline spectrums a little bit more. Let's go back to the main document. I have a more extensive set of notes on spectrums here as well. We're going to go back to Prezi. This time I'll actually log in. And, oh, isn't that great? They want me to unlock it. Let's go allow. All right, so I did create a Prezi that's going to look at this concept in greater depth. It's going to have some of the same visuals again, some of the same spectrums that we've already seen, and it's going to have some application of it. So, ideological spectrums. So that's that Learn Alberta website. We've already looked at their link with the quadrant. In terms of reactionary, often we associate fascism with the far right wing of the spectrum. They're driven to seem regressive, right? We want to regress, change to go back to the good old days. So much that they're willing to kill and die to restore the reality that once was. Then we have conservatives that like the status quo. They respect traditions, those dead wise guys that got us here. Traditional family values seem to favor the elite and business class over the working masses. Perhaps some should have a greater influence on the government, as the rich, the elite, seem to know best. Government is too large. Bureaucratic departments are too inefficient. The heartbeat of the nation is rugged individualism. That's conservatism. Then we have liberals. Liberals are seen as moderates. They do also enjoy the status quo, but they're in favor of more progressive change. The future is more important than the past. This is where the majority of Canadians lie. Then we have the NDP. They're in favor of even more progressive change, more, I wouldn't say radical change, but more system changing. And change is needed to help the disadvantaged, to help government, the disadvantaged. Government should spend money on social programs. They should raise corporate taxes to get the funds, perhaps even nationalize key industries. Universal health care is not negotiable. We must provide healthcare. We must provide education for all. There are essential services the government must have under an NDP government, and this will include also subsidizing those in need. They are the voice of the low-income workers. Then when you go all the way to the left, we have the radicals, like the Soviet Union, who desire change in a progressive direction. They're so wanting change, systemic change, they're willing to use violence to achieve it. All right, so in the States, we have two main parties. We have the Republicans, that's their conservative party, and we have the Democrats, that's their more liberal party. Then we have this whole list here. And I would suggest to you that you could definitely focus in a little bit more on those individual key talking points around economic individualism and economic collectivism. This is very similar to what I've already unpacked earlier for you, but it's there for you for more detail again. And that's another look at spectrums. So hopefully now it's getting to a point where you're like, you know what, I think I'm getting these terms. Additional notes: left-right spectrum is often used more than just economically. Sometimes it can be used politically. So I do caution you once again to take note as to what is it that they're measuring. We have some more links here to help you visualize the spectrum, including that Learn Alberta one again. And then we have some more application of spectrums here. So again, we have dictatorships on both ends, extreme right, extreme left, radicals and reactionaries can both be dictatorships, and democracy in the middle. We have an economic spectrum that has capitalism to the right of center and socialism to the left of center, and we saw what happens when we combine the two and create four quadrants. One of the games that we need to play economically is understanding that there are some terms that describe the same thing. So as we continue to use the spectrum, we'll notice that there are some terms that are used interchangeably. So you have a term on the right of the economic spectrum like capitalism, but we also use the term free market or laissez-faire or free enterprise. And therefore, the more of those related terms that we can associate or chunk together, the easier multiple choice can become. So what I would suggest to you in your notes is to create a page where you will have spectrums. And as you learn more words that mean the same thing, add it to that one spectrum. So have one page that has an economic spectrum on it, one page that has a political spectrum, and keep adding those associated terms and people to it. Here's another page that looks at some values of the left and values of the right. Now, this one you might want to zoom in a little bit because the font size is quite small. But on the left, we have values like social progress, as opposed to on the right, values like status quo. So we don't want to see evolution of society. We're really favoring the status quo. On the right, we have beliefs like religion and rights. Others must not interfere. And on the left, we have others must observe. Now, one of the main things that we see here is that when we're talking about the spectrum, the left side is really valuing this word right here, equality, whereas the right side is focused on freedom. But definitely another visual that you can use to further understand the difference between left and right. Now, we have some more multiple choice questions for you. Now, these multiple choice questions may be challenging. If you have a question that you end up struggling on, please bring it up during a hangout. Multiple choices here so that you can apply your knowledge of the spectrum and to give you some understanding of what they might look like on your diploma exam. So these are questions similar to what you would see on a diploma. Now, some of them I've already starred the answer for you. Then I'd like you to work backwards and say, why is this the answer? And then finally at the end, there's a fill-in-the-blank quiz on spectrums that you can go to and see, is it individualism that it's promoting? Is it collectivism? So you can go back to that. See how many words you can use to label the different parts of a spectrum, and see if you can understand the difference between radical, liberal, conservative, and reactionary. Again, if there's any of these that you end up struggling on, that should give you something to ask me for help during our hangout. So during these hangouts, I'm hoping it's not just dead air. I'm hoping that you come to these hangouts with questions prepared. So definitely by working through these documents that are linked into the lessons, I'm hoping that you'll be able to ask very specific questions like, number 8, I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it, by Voltaire. You might be saying, is that individualism or is that collectivism? Well, they're really embracing that freedom to speech. Freedom to speech is individualism, right? So that is individualism. Adam Smith saw this as the invisible hand that guides individuals to contribute for the common good of everyone. Now, the unique thing there is the word common good might make you say, man, that's collectivism. But no, his way to unlock the common good was through individual freedom. So number 10, individualism. So yeah, definitely take some time, work through that document as well. Application of a spectrum can be helpful because when we get to the multiple choice, again, if you can look at the 4 answers, and if 3 of them are left-wing answers and one of them is right, then you've got that 3-1 split, and it might be trying to show you the answer that will get the question correct. But yeah, that's the end of lesson 3, placing ideologies on spectrums. Thanks for listening.